Chapter 59. Transportation. Section 8. It will be proper, however, first to retrace the penal history of these settlements and to mark the incidents which moulded their form and contributed to their failure or success. The administration of the penal laws cannot be understood except by a broad and continuous survey. The developments of one colony reacted on the other. Van Diemen's Land, long the satellite of New South Wales, attended all its motions, and with it prospered or suffered. From the fortunes of that colony, the history of Tasmania is inseparable. The evils described were not of a recent origin. They may be traced from the commencement of penal colonization. The journals of the first officers exhibit all sorts of mischief, which only entered into new combinations as times advanced, and property was diffused. Collins, whose account descended to the close of the century, records a perpetual struggle with vice and crime. What could be expected of men who burned their jail at the risk of their lives and the church to escape attendance on worship? The first expiree, James Rouse, who was established in 1790 as a settler, was industrious and successful. Philip, anxious to test the competence of the land to sustain a cultivator, cleared 2 acres for this man, erected his hut, and supplied him with food. 15 months after, he relinquished his claim on the king's stores and received 30 acres of land in reward for his diligence. It thus became common to afford similar facilities to expiree convicts, but generally in vain. The solicitude of Philip was displayed in every form of kindness, but the proneness of his subjects to intemperance defeated all his efforts. He gave them stock, and had scarcely left the land when his gifts were sold for rum. His successor was not more successful when he tried the same plan. Cargoes of American spirit produced the madness of intoxication, and the freed settlers neglected their farms or anticipated their produce to obtain the liquid destruction. Their passion for gaming was universal. They sometimes staked not only their money and their goods, but even their clothing, and were seen to labor in the field, as free from clothing as the savages who surrounded them. In spite of the dread of famine, they consumed their time and substance in intemperance, sold their seed, lent to ensure their harvest. In the distribution of stores, robberies were daily committed, double rations were issued, and Collins ingenuously confesses that office converted the most trusty into thieves, and that peculations were forgiven because a change of agency was useless. All in superior circumstances, unprotected by military vigilance, were robbed and robbed again. Missionaries who fled from Tahiti found their countrymen more savage than strangers. One was wounded and plundered of all his property, and another murdered with an axe, while writing a receipt for a payment which his destroyer thus hoped to evade. The governor, in an imploring tone, enumerated the robberies which every day occurred, and hoped that the constables, in whose presence they were committed, did not profit by such crimes. Those who obtained their freedom were a source of infinite annoyance. Unable to depart from the country, they refused all kinds of labor, and, joined with others equally worthless, astonished the officers by the vigor and ingenuity of their spoliations. The account given by Collins is a valuable delineation of society when set free from moral influence, and proves how little simple coercion can check a general disposition to crime. So rare was reformation that a single instance is mentioned with triumph. Among the few who redeemed that settlement from utter dishonor was George Barrington, celebrated for his dexterity as a pickpocket and for his pathos at the bar, who robbed a prince with the grace of a courtier and was the beau ideal of swindlers. He was distinguished in New South Wales for his integrity in the office of chief constable and his diligence as a farmer. He died regretted in the year this dependency was colonized. Governor Hunter authorized the opening of a theatre at Sydney. The principal actors were convicts, and in default of a chamberlain, they were threatened for a second offence with the penal settlement. The price of admission, 1 shilling, was paid in meal or rum, taken at the door. Many had performed the part of pickpocket in a London playhouse. But at Sydney this was more difficult, yet they were not discouraged. They saw by a glance at the benches what houses were left unprotected and proceeded to rob them. The motto of the actors was modest: "We cannot command success, but we will endeavor to deserve it." Their first play was The Revenge. The first prologue, characteristic both of the actors and the audience. The aptitude of one of these couplets has transferred it into a proverb, but it is worth seeing in its connection as a representation of the real sentiments with which violations of the law were remembered. Prologue. From distant climes, o'er widespread seas we come, though not with much eclat or beat of drum. True patriots we, for be it understood, we left our country for our country's good. No private views disgraced our generous zeal, what urged our travels was our country's weal. But you inquire, what could our breast inflame with this new passion for theatric fame? He, who to midnight ladders is no stranger, you'll own will make an admirable ranger. To seek Macheath we have not far to roam, and sure in Filch I shall be quite at home. As oft on Gadge Hill we have taken our stand, when 'twas so dark you could not see your hand, from durance vile our precious selves to keep. We often had recourse to the flying leap, to a black face have sometimes owed escape, and Hounslow Heath has proved the worth of crape. But how, you ask, can we e'er hope to soar above these scenes, and rise to tragic lore? Too oft, alas, we've forced the unwilling tear, and petrified the heart with real fear. Macbeth, a harvest of applause will reap, for some of us, I fear, have murdered sleep. His lady, too, with grace will sleep and talk. Our females have been used at night to walk. Sometimes, indeed, so various is our art, an actor may improve and mend his part. Give me a horse, bawls Richard, like a drone, we'll find a man would help himself to one. Grant us your favour, put us to the test, to gain your smiles, we'll do our very best. And without dread of future turnkey lockets. Thus, in an honest way, still pick your pockets. The connection between ardent spirits and the early disorders of our penal colonies is patent at every stage of their progress. Then the habits of the navy were intemperate. Rum was considered the great parent of valour. The founders of our colonies never entertained a suspicion that society could exist without its aid. Thus, the first fleet, in their progress, touched at a port to take in a large supply, which proved of the most deleterious kind. Every vessel was deeply laden with the same commodity. The limitation of wholesale dealing to the officers was not to restrain its consumption, but to monopolize its profits. The advantage of its distribution, as an incitement to labor, atoned for the moral ravages it spread. For this reward alone would the prisoners yield their full strength, and when the taste, inflamed by indulgence, drove them to crime, or laid them in the dust, their ruin suggested no reflection beyond the general evils of intemperance. Had the light of science illuminated the imperial authorities, they perhaps had provided some check on this grand incentive to crime. The deposition of Bligh was occasioned by this fatal appetite. Whether from sullenness or conviction, he discouraged the vendors of rum and attempted to obstruct their living on the vices of the prisoners. The landing of a still and its seizure was followed by a series of altercations, which led to the military rebellion and terminated his government. This event roused the public attention for a moment to the state of the colony. In 1811 to 1812, a committee of the House of Commons was appointed to inquire into the manner in which the sentence of transportation had been executed and the effects produced by that mode of punishment. The result was remarkable. The committee advised that more constitutional tribunals should be established and distillation allowed. The ministers of the day feebly vindicated the royal commission violated in the deposition of Bligh, and having once more set in motion the machine of legal government by the appointment of Macquarie, fell back into long slumber. Thenceforth, and for many years, rum was a great agent in the working of government and the source of private opulence. The monopoly escaped official hands, but the expirees succeeded to the profitable calling. The large fortunes accumulated by many were rarely derived from any other trade. Their prosperity was traced with startling uniformity. They sold their spirits to the settlers for produce, which they vended at the royal stores. They indulged them with credit until hopelessly involved, when mortgages were executed and foreclosed with a rapidity and precision which leaves modern conveyancing in the shade. Individual powers of consumption were incredibly great. The expiree farmer and his not more intemperate prisoner servant broached the vessel, poured out its contents into buckets, and drank until they were insensible, or until, roused to frantic vigor, they were swift to shed blood. Such scenes were common. The specious advantage to the revenue exhibited by our colonial statistics protected a vice so useful. The influence of this interest cannot be overstated. To put down spirit drinking would, in equal proportion, disturb colonial finance. The demands of the public service were always in advance of its means, and no colonial administration was found sufficiently enlightened or courageous to add the prevention of this poisonous indulgence to the other consequences of banishment. Macquarie revived the policy of the Stuarts in regulating this trade. To Messrs. Wentworth, Riley, and Blaxland, he granted in 1810 the exclusive privilege of importation, and by the duty they paid 7 shillings per gallon, erected a hospital. They proved, in defiance of economists, how monopoly can sometimes enlarge the supply and thus increase the demand. They dispatched their agents to the Mauritius, India, and the Cape, and bought at 2 shillings 6pence per gallon, and arrack and rum deluged the colony. The success of their enterprise was great. In less than 2 years they obtained sufficient to raise the edifice, which could not want occupants and cost more than £20,000. The effects of this measure were flagrant. A letter addressed by Marsden, the chaplain, to Macquarie depicted the wretched condition of the prisoners. The scenes of dissipation which passed before him deprived him of repose. Freed women living at Parramatta, unprovided with public shelter, ran headlong into vice and dropped all around him, slain by rum and dissipation. He stood aghast and powerless before the devastation. At times he observed, "I envy the situation of the most menial servant who is free from this solemn and sacred responsibility." The reply of Macquarie was witty rather than relevant. He told Lord Sidmouth, in effect, that the sorrows of Marsden were too deep for discovery. Noted for the cheerfulness and even gaiety of his temper, his movements were too rapid for grief, and his days, divided between the cares of farming, grazing, and trade, to say nothing of his clerical occupation, left him no time for sorrow. The evils he described are, however, proved by uniform testimony. They must exist where dealing in spirits is the sure path to wealth, and wealth the title to social distinction. In the rocks, drunkenness and debauchery were constant and undisguised. Persons of respectable appearance in the daytime were liable to maltreatment, but those who, in the night, entered the fortress of iniquity were usually stripped and plundered. Broils and boxing matches were of perpetual occurrence. The public houses were fences, and degraded women, in large numbers, crowded these dens of thieves. It is not necessary to give a chronological history of the spirituous epoch. The reign of intemperance commenced with the first proclamation. It received all the protection of law and the favour of government. It was embodied in our penal administration. Whether it was possible to check its mischief, some may doubt, but that it has clenched the population fast, that it has formed our gangs, crowded our prisons, that it has covered our scaffolds and filled 10,000 graves, is certain as death. The correspondence maintained between the convicts and their friends informed them of their prosperity. The alluring picture, drawn by those whose bondage was past, exhibited a social state precisely suited to the taste of their kindred and acquaintance. The sensual and dissolute were tempted by the riotous jollity of the rocks, those fond of equivocal commerce with the profits of trade, and others were cheered by the assurance that a friend in bonds would find a nominal master in a relative or former friend when the formalities of inspection were over. Such as brought out spoil were besieged with offers of investment and found themselves in a market where money was the passport to favour and indulgence. Others, less fortunate, were pillaged by those who crowded them with welcomes or drawn into bargains which proved that no cozening art was lost. To illustrate the occasional good fortune of prisoners, one hazard may be worth remembrance. He had been before transported. In 1815, he arrived under a second sentence, for life. While on the voyage out, he purchased a quantity of tobacco. He received on landing a ticket of leave, immediately married the daughter of an innkeeper, and obtained a license in the name of his wife to the same calling. He was patronized by the most respectable settlers and enjoyed prosperity until his death, only 5 years after his arrival. In this colony, the acting secretary of the governor secured his ticket at his landing and was long distinguished for the extent of his influence and the elegance of his dwelling. It may be presumed that, however explained on the spot, these examples were not lost on the Republic of Thieves, and many were disposed to try that fortune which was so often propitious. The Ordinary of Newgate, Mr. Cotton, a well-known name, in his evidence before the Commons in 1818, has left nothing to conjecture. The prisoners of his day looked on transportation as a party of pleasure. They departed from the prison with huzzas and bade glad adieu to their less happy companions and keepers, exclaiming, "What a glorious kangaroo hunt we will have at the bay! Stabant orantes primi transmittere cursum, tendebantque manus ripae ulterioris amore." Virgil. To distinguish bravado from triumph is sometimes difficult, but there must have been little to appall where there was so much to hope, nor did they perceive that, though many were fortunate, not a few, at the brightest era, groaned in bondage. That degradation and suffering sometimes reached their utmost limits, at which death itself stops the hand of vengeance. The opinions that prevailed among the prisoners, in reference to the intentions of the British government, were adopted by Macquarie himself. He held, like them, that the colony was established for the benefit of persons convicted, and that in forming a system of political government, their social welfare was the grand design to pursue. The notion was not without support. In the nominal list of the First Fleet, not more than 50 in all were banished for terms exceeding 7 years. To suppose that these were perpetually excluded from the immunities of British subjects would be to attribute to expatriation a forfeiture beyond the operation of English law. The opinion was further fortified by the distribution of land, under regulations which were intended to encourage their permanent settlement, and limited only to such as, by their good conduct and disposition to industry, should be deserving of favour and receive emancipation and discharge from their servitude. This opinion was still further sustained by the comparative neglect of emigration and the selection of officers for situations of authority and trust from the ranks of the prisoners. A comparison of property acquired by the various classes in 1820 explains many anomalies in their social aspect and vindicates the policy of Macquarie himself. It is shown that the emancipists and their children were more than 5 times in excess of the free, and that their property in land, trade, and commerce exceeded by more than 1/2 the possessions of the voluntary settlers. To erect the barriers of caste around so small a section and to exclude emancipists from the common intercourse of social life was a task no governor could then accomplish without danger. The changes which followed Macquarie's administration, especially the growth of a free population, enabled his successors to effect what, in 1817 to 1820, had been attempted in vain. The opposition encountered by Macquarie, and which he resented with the ardour of his character, enabled his enemies to represent him as the patron of criminals. He was said to look upon their offences in the light of misfortunes, which they were to repair in the country of their exile, rather than to atone by the severities of toil and privation, and that they were taught to look upon no title to property as so just as that which had been derived by passing from crime to conviction, from thence to servitude, emancipation, and grant. The difference of opinion and feeling between the governor and military led to the combination of emancipists who did not veil their former condition but ennobled it by raising it to a political interest, who adopted a designation and formed a system of morality, to which it is useless to look for a parallel. They returned with bitterness the reproaches of the free and insisted on the benefit of the proverb, which ascribes more virtue to the vigour of reformation than the constancy of obedience. Their advocates would ask with exultation whether any emigrants were found whose life would bear a scrutiny, whether greater crimes are not tolerated by the refinements of vice than those which are commonly visited with the vengeance of the law, or exhibiting the doctrines of Christianity in their aspect to the penitent, they thundered forth denunciations against the proud and the self-righteous. The champion of this system, Mr. W.C. Wentworth, turned the artillery of his wrath against the exclusionists. "And shall not," he exclaimed in the ardour of his youth, "shall not the sole efficacious remedy be administered? The restoration of the civil rights, capacity to become magistrates and legislators, because a set of interlopers, in no wise connected with the purposes for which this colony was founded, wished to monopolize all the respectable offices of the government, all the functions of emolument, dignity, and power themselves. How can they expect pardon of God if they withhold oblivion from their repentant fellow creatures? Retrospection should not be pushed beyond the period of arrival, but then subsequent good behavior should be subject to the severest tests. The reconvicted offender, branded with the lasting impressions of infamy, should be rendered ever after incapable. Such was the recognized code of the emancipist. It were indeed easy to see that the several convictions of some small rogue might not, in their aggregation, equal the crime of him who sinks a ship, or burns a house, or the guilt of an atrocious offence, which escapes the last penalty of public vengeance by some legal error, but to obliterate the first stigma of those who constituted the great body of a population and whose self-respect was their chief chance of virtue, was not unreasonable. The evils which rose from this system of oblivion are to be traced to the indiscretion which formed a community of criminal origin. The effects produced by their equipages, luxury and licentiousness on the British population, when set forth in the language of romance, were not to be charged on the local government. It is in the nature of commerce to collect wealth. The traders were nearly all expirés. They became rich, not because they were transported, but because some were industrious, others saving, and others fraudulent, and because they were in the midst of a system of expenditure which made the Treasury of England their bank. The acquisitions of men who had been prisoners with great absurdity and forgetfulness were attributed to the laxity of the local governors. Even now, many who are dexterous, shrewd, and persevering acquire considerable properties. Their prosperity awakens no alarm because they are lost amidst a dense population and are surrounded by emigrants who by similar vices or virtues are not less opulent, but far more numerous. The first sound that fell on the ear of the prisoner when he stood before Governor Macquarie tended to animate his confidence. Having inquired of his treatment through the voyage, he then informed him that the past was left to oblivion, and that the future would determine his condition. This was often no vain promise. The sentiments he expressed were, more or less, recognized by the preceding governors. The Commons, in 1812, gave his policy their sanction, and Earl Bathurst, though with more reserve, favoured the same opinion. Macquarie never disguised this system of mercy. When transportation only contemplated the establishment of a colony, this system of oblivion was useful. But the passage from the bar of justice to liberty was sometimes not longer than the passage from England, and those who rose to wealth by their character and career gave to public retribution the aspect of grimace. On the appointment in 1814 of H. as Superintendent of Convicts, an office then of greater real power than any other in the penal department of the British Empire, Macquarie, says Beeger, gave an enumeration of his merits and continued frequently to publish in the Gazette eulogies on his character. This is slyly sketched by the Commissioner himself, and with more precision by Dr. Reed, who was on the spot at the time. Mr. H. was a convict, and was placed in office at Sydney, but breaking into the King's Stores, either in person or by deputy, and taking away a bale of slops, he was retransported to Norfolk Island, where he won the government notice by his diligence as a dealer in pork, and was recommended by the Commandant to Macquarie. This man exercised his functions in the Turkish style. He rigorously depressed all unseasonable attempts at virtue, but nothing was impossible to those who were able and willing to pay, for whom he was accustomed to act as banker. His manners were coarse to loathsomeness, and he addressed the prisoners in language which outstripped their own, eclipsed them in wickedness and in revolting filthiness. Nor was his domestic position more respectable. His wife was one of two, too bad for endurance, who were forced from the colony and sent to England for reformation. Such was the man entrusted with more than magisterial power. While the female prisoners were landed, his clerks became brokers for masters, friends, and husbands. When ships arrived, boats crowded round them, and the visitors chose, among the female prisoners, a wife or such other relative as might answer to their prior engagements. Having sworn to these ties of kin, the superintendent assigned them according to the plan of the contracting parties, who, within 24 hours, had been total strangers. We may imagine the éclat with which so clever a device would be appeared to the correspondents of the fortunate transport. Those whose appearance or dullness excluded them from these resources were taken to the factory. On their arrival, according to custom, they were met by a body of men who, having satisfied the constables, spread before these women the spirits and provisions provided for the feast of welcome. What followed need not be told. The connivance of the superintendent with the most of these excesses might be expected from his character, and although he displayed considerable tact in subjecting the prisoners to his control, his appointment and prerogatives almost justified, and they fully accounted for, the rancour with which his patron was opposed and condemned. Thus Macquarie did not exercise the caution requisite to preserve his generous designs from parliamentary censure. Imprudent efforts to give effect to his conviction involved him in a contest which hastened his recall, and it is said, shortened his life. He raised to the bench and invited to his table several emancipists of wealth, and made their social reception the condition of his favour. When elevating to offices, he sometimes violated his own rule of forgetting the past, by basing his eulogy on the reformation of the person he delighted to honour. The details of their character, furnished by the indignant or malicious, cast an air of ridicule on their public reception. The subalterns of the army refused to join their superior officers in entertainments at which emancipists were guests. The resentment of Macquarie aggravated the quarrel until the differences divided the colony into factions and finally originated the emancipist party, and by provoking observation tended to increase the severity which fell on their successors. In those times of despotism, many were transported for political offences, which in Great Britain leave no moral stigma, and when forgiven by the Crown, close no social circle. The prosperity of New South Wales, founded on the government expenditure, so vast as to excite the most serious complaints, but so subtle as to elude imperial censure, was but slightly participated by Van Diemen's Land. Its later occupation, the low character of the first settlers, and the subordinate station of its ruler afforded no room for fashion. Many emancipists in Sydney had become wealthy by the vices of the less cunning and thrifty, and created a social state without a precedent. They could command the most expensive luxuries, and, compared with them, the highest officers of the government were poor. They looked for the honours of opulence, and did not perceive that an emancipist must pass through oblivion to honour, and that, in this case, to distinguish is to stigmatize. It was observed by Mr. Bigg that when Macquarie made some emancipists magistrates, and professed by that dignity to restore them to the station they had lost, he forgot that they were elevated to a rank they had never filled. It was equally true that a large number of free colonists, whose pretensions in early life were equally limited, rose by opulence to a superior station and higher pretensions. To deny the usual appendages of their position would be virtually to degrade them. Whether just or not, the formal exclusion of emancipists was a supplement to the penalty of the law, and, as such, must have been taken. It is not the actual exaltation but equal eligibility of British subjects to the highest station, which constitutes that equality so grateful to Englishmen. The son of a sweep may keep the conscience of a king. There were freed men who were even detestable for their wealth, others whose offences would not have excluded them from any society. Such was that of Mr. Redfern, transported when a boy for dropping a word to the mutineers of the Nore. Society will ever make its exceptions, founded on the nature of the offence, the proofs of reformation, or the general character. But Governor Macquarie resolved to wash out the stain by authority and to treat those as enemies who disputed his policy or refused to share in its promotion. The determination of the free to make no distinction between those who merited the oblivion of their offences and emancipists atrocious in their history and character rendered the hostility of caste more inveterate. The measures of Macquarie were followed by years of faction, a press representing emancipist interests and emancipist principles, and making the governor the instrument or the object of the most violent hatred. Still, on their side, the emigrants were often positive, virulent, and contemptuous. From this, Van Diemen's Land was free. There were few whose wealth or education could pretend to rank. One gentleman so situated, Mr. Gatehouse, by his respectability and intelligence, won the respect of all classes. He was admitted to the table of the governor and was only distinguished by the colonists for his enterprise and probity. When an office of trust was in their gift, they chose him to share it with the chief merchants of the island, and thus pronounced the judgment which good men will adopt against both an undiscriminating ban and an unlimited admission. The commissioner, Big, joined with the anti-emancipists in almost every prejudice or opinion. Great as were the services he rendered by his keen observation and courageous delineation of colonial society, in this and some other instances he overlooked those facts of its history which gave a disastrous prominence and authority to the emancipist settlers, and enabled them to claim consideration which offended the freemen, not always superior in substantial merit, but disabilities far more serious and unexpected united the emancipists and obtained the sympathy of many who could not be charged with indifference to crime. The remission of punishment was in the discretion of the governor-in-chief. The 30 George III authorized the granting of pardons, and the commission of the governor, which recited this provision, was supposed to convey the power. In 1811, Macquarie declared that a long course of good conduct would be an essential preliminary, but the rule was more easily stated than enforced, and in 1813, one day in the year was fixed for pardons. It was declared that conditional pardons could only be granted when 10 years, or half sentence, had expired, or for absolute pardons until 15 years, or 3/4 had been fulfilled. Fond of dispensing mercy, he appointed a day when those who thought themselves entitled crowded his presence. The petitions, drawn up by letter writers, dwelt on every topic calculated to move to compliance, among which were profuse compliments to the governor's benevolence and humanity. The concourse of suppliants was often very great, many venturing to ask who did not hope to obtain, and whose sole claim to mercy was the bad terms on which they lived with the law. The crowd pressed on with their 700 petitions, which the governor read in their presence, and by one letter of the alphabet gave liberty to the impatient captives, or sent them back to merit freedom as freedom was then merited. The court of clemency, thronged by suitors, would have afforded a fine subject to the artist, a scene unique in the history of man. The dispensation of pardons was not regulated by any uniform principles. The interest of superintendents was given, as the reward of task work performed for the Crown, more successful by services rendered to themselves. Such was a common condition, but many are mentioned who obtained their pardons on easier terms than personal labour. The loan of a horse and cart, driven by his assigned servants, procured the liberation of the lender. Others hired vehicles to convey His Excellency's baggage during his progresses, and thus paid in money the price of freedom. The bargain was public, and questions of national policy never entered the minds of him who granted, or those procuring the royal mercy. The grant of pardons thus formed an important department of Macquarie's government. A decision of the Court of King's Bench, Bullock v. Dodds, where the plaintiff was an emancipist, seemed to peril their freedom and property. The defendant, when sued in England on a bill, pleaded the attaint of the plaintiff who had received the pardon of Macquarie. The validity of these remissions, which affected great numbers, was thus brought to the test. The Chief Justice, Abbott, declared that an attainted person was, in law, as one civiliter mortuus. He might acquire, not because he was entitled to hold any possession, but because a donor could not make his own act void and reclaim his own gift. Thus, a person giving or conveying property could not recall it, but the convict attaint could not hold it, and it passed to the hands of the Crown, in whom the property of the convict vested. This being the law, any ticket of leave holder, or any person whatever standing on the pardon of the governor, was liable to be deprived by the Crown or obstructed at any moment in attempting to recover by suit at law. The practice of the Sydney Supreme Court had long virtually rejected such distinctions. The mixed considerations of convenience and equity induced the judges to allow the witnesses and plaintiffs the same privilege, whether under attainder or not. Judge Field declared that while the Crown did not interfere, the court would not touch the property of the convict. Nothing but an attested copy of conviction would be admitted as evidence of conviction, nor would the proof of transportation of itself, as the law then stood, prove the incompetence of a witness. His time might have expired, his expatriation might have been the condition of his pardon, or his offence might have been a misdemeanor and not involve the corruption of blood. and, except for perjury or subornation of perjury, the king's pardon might restore his competency to give evidence or hold property. On these grounds, the courts of New South Wales were enabled to evade the plea of attainder in bar of a just action. But the decision of the King's Bench discovered a serious omission in the forms of pardon issued by Macquarie, and further inquiry even threw doubt on his power to grant them at all. The Act of Parliament empowered the Crown to delegate the authority to remit a sentence of transportation to the Governor of New South Wales. But the Commission of Macquarie said nothing of this power, except the criminals were colonially convicted, when he could grant reprieves and pardons. His instructions authorised the pardons to British offenders, and those instructions were warranted by parliamentary enactment. But the Royal Commission gave no such power, and thus all his pardons were legally void. Another essential condition was neglected. To give effect to the pardon of the Governor, it was required that he should transmit to the Secretary of State the names of the persons whose sentences he remitted to secure their insertion in the next list of general pardons. This course had never been taken. No list of remissions had been furnished to Downing Street. Among the extraordinary omissions of the government at home was in many instances the place of trial, and even the sentence of the transports. To save the labour of penmanship, ditto, was sometimes the sentence found under another name, in the line of which 7 or 14 was written, not at full length, but in numerals. Some indents exhibited erasures. In one, a sentence of 7 years had been converted to life. More strange than all, some were sent without even their names, and others without any sort of information of their crime or sentence. And the authorities felt justified in gaining by artifice, from the unsuspecting prisoners themselves, what the ministers had neglected to furnish. An Irishman, who could give no information, was suited to a sentence by a process of analogy. He was set down, in compliment to his comrade, for life. The regular transmission of this kind of information was neglected chiefly by the Irish executive, ever slow to perceive the obligation of reason and justice. The longevity of abuses is among the most instructive lessons of history. The First Fleet left their lists with the owners of the transports. Soon after their arrival, several prisoners declared their sentence was completed. This the government was unable to affirm or deny, and therefore did nothing. But one of the claimants, having expressed his discontent in a manner disrespectful to the Lieutenant Governor, received 600 lashes and 6 months in irons. Such atrocious neglect of the first principles of equity is a sad set-off against the license of indiscriminate pardons. The Roman judge was a far better casuist, for it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. A quarrel between Mr. Justice Field and Mr. Egar, an emancipist attorney, displayed more forcibly the effect of the decision of the English Chief Justice. Judge Field presided at a session of magistrates at Parramatta when Agar attempted to act as counsel. This was prevented by the court, and the judge, as chairman, expressed himself in reference to Agar in terms of severe disapprobation and contempt, stigmatizing him as a common barrator or mover of quarrels, whom the governor might justly prosecute for sedition or banish from the colony. Agar, not daunted by the philippic of the judge, resolved to sue him in a secondary court for slander, and to recover back fees paid in the Supreme Court, and which he alleged the judge had levied illegally. But Judge Field ordered his solicitor to file an affidavit of his belief that Agar was under attainder, and prayed for time to obtain an office copy of his conviction. This course was allowed, and the action defeated. Not long after, Agar attempted to recover certain penalties imposed by the Act of Charles II on foreign merchants trading in the British plantations. The penalties were enormous, and the law was obsolete. The particular object of Agar was to suppress the competition in the sale of tea, which the superior trading connection of Messrs. L. Mestre and Company enabled them to offer. The French merchant very fairly pleaded the attaint of the plaintiff, and Judge Field, in giving judgment, insisted on the obvious injustice of the suit, that men whose trading was permissive, themselves the creatures of indulgence, and who, by connivance, were allowed to become wealthy and prosperous, should endeavour to rouse forgotten and restrictive statutes, to put down useful commerce, and abuse privileges conceded by the clemency of the court, to force the court to become the instrument of oppression. He therefore allowed the plea of the merchants to bar the action of the plaintiff. All this, on the face of it, was just, but the emancipists saw that it gave to the judge a discretion which laid them helpless at his mercy. The same plea might be offered to cover a fraudulent debtor or deprive a large majority of traders of legal protection. Nor was it a competent answer that the policy of the colony had been of an opposite description. To stand on suffrage was to stand in peril. Prompted by this feeling, the emancipists formed themselves into committees at all the settlements and obtained the countenance of the governor to a plan for moving the British legislature to correct the anomalies of the law. At a public meeting, Mr. Redfern presiding, the administration of Governor Macquarie was the subject of their glowing eulogy. They predicted that his name would be immortalized by the gratitude of their descendants, who would remember his policy with veneration. Against this meeting, the judges protested and professed to foresee great peril to the dignity of their tribunals and to the public safety. But the calm and guarded proceedings of the emancipists avoided the scandal and gained their cause some support. The indignation of the judges was unreasonable. In the administration of justice, they had usually protected the equitable rights of the emancipists. But it was no reason for astonishment that a large trading interest felt uneasy in holding by indulgence privileges of so great importance, and were anxious to obtain, by a declaratory statute, the remedy of their grievances. Mr. Eager was nominated secretary to their body and instructed to obtain parliamentary support. In this he was successful. In the discussions of the Commons, the discontent of the emancipists was condemned by the Tories and vindicated by the Whigs. Peel charged Macquarie with culpable neglect in omitting to forward the lists, but he observed no general pardon had been issued for 50 years. What it meant was unknown. The Act required the governor to send home the names and the secretary to insert them in a general pardon, but he could not tell in what manner to perform this duty. This was, he said, of no practical moment. An individual might sue out a pardon under the Great Seal without cost. He strongly opposed vesting by law in the governor a power to grant absolute pardons, an interference with the prerogative royal, and dangerous to public justice. To sustain this opinion, he instanced the case of a man who had been transported for forging a title to an estate, and who, under such a pardon, had returned to Scotland to pursue his claim. The zeal of Agar in the cause of the emancipists provoked the animadversion of ministers. They hinted that he was liable to be treated as a felon at large and was indebted to the lenity of the executive for his safety. But Sir James Mackintosh, who gave respectability to the cause he espoused, vindicated the claims of the emancipist with great warmth and excused the earnestness with which the confirmation of his title to liberty had been sought. That great and good man displayed, in every debate, the generosity of his temper. Always the enemy of despotism, every form of oppression called him into action, and the emancipists were largely indebted to his eloquence. After long delay, this agitating question was settled, but with a reservation of serious moment. The new law confirmed all the pardons granted in New South Wales, with the rights they included rendering them of full effect when they should be ratified by the Crown. It further provided that no future pardon should be held valid until allowed by the Secretary of State, and then only within the colony of New South Wales and its dependencies, a serious drawback from the attractions of the boon, as understood before, but which was no barrier to the further extension of the royal clemency. The opponents of Macquarie argued that the profusion of mercy had not been followed by reformation. The emancipists, they alleged, were unchanged in principle and never abandoned their habits of crime. This view was sustained by Mr. Wentworth's representations, which were intended to subserve another end. He attempted to prove that financial oppression had driven back the expire on his former course, which the anti-emancipists maintained he had never forsaken. It was, however, the universal opinion that atrocious crimes were diminished and misdemeanors increased. The penal statistics were swollen by the extensive jurisdiction of police, by the cognizance of acts which, in other countries, are left to opinion. The distribution of public money, annually increasing towards $250,000, placed within the reach of all the pleasures they were accustomed to obtain without the risks of crime. A closer inspection does not, however, exalt our opinion of their moral worth. Of 4,376 emancipists reported by the chaplains, 369 were tolerable, but 296 only were respectable. Nor was the accusation without force that the proof of reform admitted by Macquarie was the possession of money, that to thrive, by whatever means, within the letter of the statute, was to honour the law and to deserve well of the Crown. The administration of Macquarie was attacked with great vehemence, and every detail of his scheme called in question. The British government never had a system. The ministers treated every difficulty as a thing apart from all others, and thus to arrest one form of mischief, they released another. They directed the establishment of separate settlements and thus occasioned the vast expenses of their control. They then approved the concentrated labour of Macquarie, and when its cost became severe, advocated dispersion. Every parliamentary discussion terminated in the abandonment of some principle or the establishment of some novelty. Always affected by the passing aspect of transportation, the people of Great Britain never acquire a connected view of the causes which alter its results, and have thus condemned or applauded the local officers for events casual or inevitable. To diminish the pressure of the prisoners on the British Treasury, Macquarie granted tickets of leave. The holders, without employment and without capital, became robbers. Then he turned his thoughts to public works of permanent utility and requiring continued labour. These projects gradually absorbed his attention and perhaps perverted his judgment. Inspired by an able architect, whom the chances of public retribution had thrown in his way, his erections greatly surpassed the simple constructions of his predecessors. The settlement assumed the aspect of a large building establishment, such as was seen in the ancient world, when captives were subject to taskmasters and generals were chief masons. The more skillful the mechanic, the greater his value to the works and the smaller his chance of liberty. Yet, to reconcile him to his lot, he was mostly permitted to choose his own abode, and was enabled by his surplus time to obtain all the comforts and luxuries of the colony. But the expenditure, which added to the opulence of the settlers, enabled them to build also. They looked with envy on the government, which detained so large a proportion of the mechanical power. They forgot that the unproductive employment of large numbers created the demand for their crops, without which no dollar had been theirs to spend. Their outcries rung in the ears of the commissioner. He blamed the improvidence of the governor, who had rejected their applications, and threw some ridicule on his architectural ambition. The commissioner only saw a jail, but Macquarie believed that when he erected an edifice, he was forming a model, and that in aiming at symmetry and refinement, he was fixing the taste of a people. The difficulty of reconciling adverse elements in penal colonization has been ever visible. The modern principles of colonization demand concentration. The establishment of so many branch settlements was considered, from the beginning, a great economical error, and by those unaware of its justification was the subject of strong and pointed condemnation. No sooner, it was observed, had the settlers landed their boxes, than they started a division for Norfolk Island, and others, in rapid succession, broke off into fragmentary colonies. The same bridges, schools, and courts would be sufficient for 10,000 united people, but must be multiplied with the separate settlements. It was urged that the concentration of labour would decrease the expense of its supervision and extend the resources of the community by varying its industry. Such were the doctrines of political writers, but when they were adopted, they were found to produce unforeseen practical results. The dispersion of the first era was necessary to safety. In the time of Macquarie, the public was in no apprehension of rebellion or famine, and thus prisoners could be combined. But the aggregation of bad men will always exhibit an appalling and disgusting aspect, and the excesses, sufferings, and debasement connected with the public works, the peculation of the officers, and the indolence of the men, brought again in view the evils of associated labour, and reinforced the arguments for dispersion. The men, when together, became dealers, and indulged in all the vices of cities. Scattered, they became savage, and filled the colonies with crimes. The secondary settlements have been often the theatres of great iniquity and oppression, and the commandants have dared injustice, which no supreme authority would venture to these meaner and sometimes contemptible agents. The prisoners must be subjected on the principle of dispersion. Such practical difficulties start up at every instant and thus expose the policy of the government to perpetual oscillation. An instance of later date will demonstrate the danger of minute subdivisions, which exclude a public press and a public opinion. A commandant resolved the seduction of the daughter of a prisoner. He crept into her father's house and offered violence. The father wrote to the governor, Brisbane, his letter passing, of course, through the office of the commandant, who read the complaint and ordered the aged parent to the triangles. The doctor, knowing the nature of the offence, refused his sanction, on a plea of health. The tyrant still insisted, but the obstinate humanity of the surgeon prevailed. What then? The father was sent from the station, and, after a while, the daughter was thrown on Sydney, a prostitute. This officer had an accomplished wife. She detected improper company in her room, and her exasperated husband broke her arm to repress her outcries. It is to such hands that the prisoner has been too often entrusted, to men only known for their vices, broken down by debt and dissipation, who have taken refuge, with the wrecks of their fortune and reputation, in a military command. The obligation of this history to the reports of Mr. Bigg renders it proper to explain the origin, nature and operation of his commission. The representations of several colonists that the administration of Macquarie was subversive of public justice and favourable to crime, that his expenditure was lavish and his projects ridiculous, had reached the House of Parliament. To these charges, the Reverend Samuel Marsden, chaplain and magistrate, added the full weight of his authority. This person, from his long residence, had assumed a prominent place among the magistrates. By his connection with two great societies for the propagation of Christianity, the Church and the London, he commanded large influence in the religious world. Nothing can be more opposite than the estimates of his character given by the partisans of the emancipists and those furnished by his ecclesiastical associates. Soured by the vices rampant around him and perhaps deteriorated by the administration of justices, when it was hard to distinguish the magistrate from the executioner, he does not always appear to have merited the unmeasured eulogies of his friends. He was, however, celebrated for his attention to the islands of the Pacific, whose welfare he promoted with exemplary diligence. His house was the home of the missionaries who touched at Port Jackson, whose letters spread through Europe the reputation of his benevolence. In reference to his ultimate intentions, their apprehension of his character was probably just. But the magisterial office is rarely compatible with the duties of an ecclesiastic, least of all when punishments were discretionary and inflicted on the spot. The servant, charged with a misdemeanour, he flogged, who then took to the bush and, reappearing, charged with a capital crime, was hanged, and the magisterial divine attended him on the scaffold. This was not peculiar. Most clergymen were magistrates, but Marsden was warm and sensitive, perhaps resentful. The punishments he inflicted were distinguished for their severity, his opposition to vice, his unsuccessful struggle to prevent it, and some methods of coercion, not then uncommon, but which now look like torture, exposed him to the hatred of the prisoners. The differences between Macquarie and this resolute clergyman were frequent. They ended in open rupture, and at length became so personally offensive to the governor that Marsden was dismissed from the Commission of the Peace. Mr. Henry Grey Bennet, Member of Parliament for Shrewsbury, addressed a letter to Earl Bathurst, founded on the material furnished by Mr. Marsden. This publication delineated a great variety of abuses and charged Macquarie with ignorance, rashness, and oppression. Having thus prepared the way, a motion was made in Parliament, which led to the issue of the Commission of Inquiry, entrusted to John Thomas Bigg, Esquire, a relative of Mr. Bennet, and by profession a barrister. The commissioner was attended by Mr. Hobbs Scott, formerly a wine merchant and afterwards Archdeacon of New South Wales, on whom the prosecution of the inquiry devolved in the event of the commissioner's death. The appointment of this commission was extremely painful to Macquarie. It expressed distrust in the government or the ascendancy of his opponents in Parliament. Nor was it difficult to foresee that an inquiry conducted by one individual who must depend on the statements of factions and colonial factions of all the least scrupulous and always liable to many serious errors, must become a formidable instrument in the hands of one or other of the parties struggling for supremacy. The commissioner landed in October 1819 in New South Wales, with the honours due to a gentleman distinguished by the royal confidence. The civil and military officers, with a large assemblage of the colonists, collected to witness the ceremony of presentation. The oaths of allegiance and supremacy were administered by the judge advocate, and the commission read. This document recited that it was necessary to inquire into the laws, regulations, civil, military, and ecclesiastical, and to ascertain the revenue, trade, and resources of the colonies. The commissioner was charged to report the information collected and his opinions thereon. Macquarie addressed the commissioner and congratulated himself and the colony on the arrival of a servant of the king so eminent. Nothing could inspire him with greater hope for the public weal. The assistance in his power he would cheerfully afford. The prosperity of the colony would gratify the first wish of his heart. The commissioner then addressed the assembly, stating that though the terms of his commission were explicit and comprehensive, he deemed it right to embrace the occasion to explain the object of His Majesty's government and to prevent any possible misapprehension of their motives. The increase of transportation to these colonies and the doubts entertained of the efficacy of the system of secondary punishments had prompted the inquiry. His arrival had been delayed, but the time would give opportunity for minute research into the state of crime undertaken by Mr. Buxton and for the revision of the penal code. It belonged to himself to examine whether these colonies had answered the purposes of their institution, and whether their attainments in civilization had not disqualified them from fulfilling their original design, or whether it were yet possible to render transportation a terror at home, and an instrument of punishment and reformation. This, though the principal topic, would not exclude others of moment. He expected assistance from every class, and felt encouraged from the display of candour by the head of the government, from which he augured the most beneficial results. He then concluded in the following words: "I will only add, I bring to this investigation the deepest conviction of its importance. I approach it without any prejudice that can influence my future opinions, either of systems or individuals. I feel a determination, from which no earthly consideration shall move me, of conducting it to its conclusion with the strictest impartiality to all. In the course of the inquiry I mean to pursue, I shall give sufficient opportunities to those whose attendance I may require to consider the points submitted to them for their declarations and opinions. I wish to impress on everyone that my principal object is the attainment of truth, and while I am free to declare that nothing is to be apprehended from a fair and candid disclosure of truth, yet I am equally bound to apprise the community that nothing is to be hoped for from the concealment of the truth for private purposes, or from the gratification of malignant feelings and personal resentment." He warmly acknowledged his honourable reception from Governor Macquarie, who assigned him precedence to all but the Lieutenant Governor. The Commissioner's arrival in Van Diemen's Land in 1820 was attended with the same military honours. Wherever he went, he was received with ceremony and watched with jealousy and apprehension. The habits of Mr. Bigg were simple, complacent, and industrious. He laboured to draw from all classes their feelings and designs. Nothing escaped his curiosity. His opinions are given on every subject with equal quietness, whether they relate to the salting of beef or the most profound questions of government. The reports he sent to the Secretary of State descended to the smallest matters. He noted every rood of land granted and every ration issued. The style of these documents is felt to be prolix, and their arrangement perplexing. Their contents excited very general interest in England, and in Australasia unbounded indignation. Whatever epithet of hatred and contempt could be applied by impotence and wrath, for years fell on the imperturbable commissioner and his secretary. He was charged with eavesdropping, back-parlour scandal, partisanship, and wilful lying. The particular delineation of individual conduct, and which he thought requisite to illustrate systems, excited the utmost vexation. It was painful to officers to find their character, their habits, and the profits of their places laid open to national observation. Perhaps those details were sometimes beyond an obvious political necessity, but the plain exhibition of principles in Old English phrases, giving vice its true name, measuring the results of transportation by a standard recognized outside both the messroom and the jail, was of vast advantage to the colonists themselves. The reference made to Bigg's reports in this work, however, is always limited to facts, which could not be distorted or coloured. His connections and the spirit of his mission prejudiced his judgment, respecting a system which had been the growth of circumstances, but his integrity is transparent, not less than his prepossessions. Time will extract the sting of his disclosures, but their moral results will remain. They tended to destroy those evils which can only live in a congenial atmosphere and wither, except in the shade. The reports of the Commissioner were published by order of the House of Commons in 1822. Macquarie closed his official career on the 1st December 1821, having held the government for 12 years. Thus, their labours and opinions came before the Parliament and the world together. Macquarie, when he considered himself entitled to reward for a period of service of unusual length, found it was necessary to defend his reputation. Betrayed by the warmth of his temper into some irregular acts, which ill expressed the ordinary spirit of his government, he was vulnerable to his assailants. The flogging of freed men, notwithstanding the precedents left by his predecessors, the scandalous neglect of moral precautions in the disposal of the women, and prominent instances of unjustifiable lenity, constituted serious deductions from his merit. He was, however, exempted from pointed censure, and the Crown assigned loan 1,000 per annum as his retiring pension. This favour was scarcely conferred when he was called before that tribunal, where conduct and motives are seen together. He died at St. James's, London, on the 1st January 1824, and his remains were carried to the Isle of Mull, North Britain, where, according to his last wish, they rest in the tomb of his fathers. General Macquarie is entitled to be regarded as the founder of these colonies. Before his time, they were but hutted camps. To their improvement he devoted all his energies. He foresaw and felt the inspiration of their destined greatness. His disinterestedness was exemplary. Throughout his long administration, no sordid project was connected with his name. No patriot ever laboured more earnestly for his country's welfare. Every device which seemed to promise material advancement to the community was certain of his favour. Every contribution from the meanest settler was sure to obtain its reward. But if he accepted neither gold nor silver as the recompense of his cares, he took pledges of the colonies for the immortality of his name. It resounds in every place and is united in every form with the natural objects and history of these regions. The name of his son, of his wife, of his native mountains and early haunts, all flourish in this hemisphere. Of these, many were conferred by the flattery or kindness of his friends. Their frequent recurrence confuses geography. They echo from hill to dale and from the river to the sea. The moral character of Macquarie was not impeached. Happy in his domestic relationships, as a husband and father, he exhibited an example of fidelity and tenderness. The people quickly learned this key to his regard, and he felt with all the gratitude of a generous nature the reverence paid to the virtues of his wife and the interest affected for his son. Mrs. Macquarie supported his efforts to reclaim the colonists from the habits of concubinage, which disgraced their early history. She could not, without utter seclusion, enforce those social rules which are proper in more settled society. But her sentiments were unequivocal and hastened many a marriage and saved many escutcheons from a bar. Mrs. Macquarie survived her husband 10 years. She expired at Mull in March 1834. The indifference to moral worth ascribed to Macquarie will admit another view. He estimated too highly the agency of affluence in raising the moral sentiments, but in promoting external decency it has considerable power. Macquarie was a soldier and a man of the world. Those delicate springs, which set in motion the finer affections of the soul, are open to the Christian, but are not found on the battlefield, in the courts of law, or the seat of government. The notions of this ruler were material. He believed that another generation would cast off the habits of the passing and abhor and forget the vices of their parents. Nor was he mistaken. The admitted political errors of Macquarie's government must be largely ascribed to his peculiar position. When we scan the system he constructed or modified, justice requires that we should consider not only the materials he possessed, but the condition in which he found them. The rebellion of the officers had destroyed their authority. The stores were exhausted, discipline relaxed, and those who had exacted the most servile homage were themselves dependent for impunity on the royal clemency. He employed the discretion with which he was entrusted to avert the miseries of forfeiture, but he could not restore the relations between the bond and the free, which revolt had shaken, or dispense with the counterpoise of emancipist support. Many years elapsed ere the reaction of his system attracted the attention of Parliament. Until then, it was approved or tolerated by the Crown. The pressure of a strong and united party, what ministers have the courage to withstand? They were willing that the governor should bear the odium of measures long subject to their cognizance, which they had passed by unreproved and sometimes even applauded. Macquarie thought he had gained a triumph when he raised emancipists to social distinction and detained a mass of transgressors within the rules of obedience. And for a time, so thought the ministers. They desired to establish a city out of the materials of the jail, but when they saw the success of their plans, half civic, half felonious, they were terrified at their own creation and wished the city had remained a prison. In this feeling, Macquarie did not participate. He delighted in the result of his policy, and wondered at the inexorable cruelty of those who grudged an asylum to their unfortunate countrymen who attempted to dash from their lips the liberty and hope they began to taste. Whether it were possible, without a free community, to retain 10,000 persons in perpetual vassalage, or to uphold a system of simple coercion and social exclusion in a colony so remote, remains a question. But it is none that the name of Macquarie will become more illustrious as the traditions of faction subside and classes are blended in the unity of a people. It will be said that he found a garrison and a jail and left the deep and broad foundations of an empire. Footnotes 1. The Life of George Barrington, written by himself, a respectable volume in size and typography, was published in 1810. Nearly every paragraph is copied from Collins, the style being first debased, and the coloured sketches are a mere piracy from other volumes. It was thought fair by the ingenious booksellers to use the name of a popular pickpocket rather than one so little known as a lieutenant governor. Of posthumous agency in thus picking the pockets of the prigging race, George Barrington's memory must be acquitted. 2. 18 years ago, 1802, the period when I arrived in this colony, it was lamentable to behold the excess to which drunkenness was carried. It was no uncommon occurrence for men to sit round a bucket of spirits and drink it with quart pots until they were unable to stir from the spot. Dr. Redfern's Replies to Macquarie, published by Parliament. This reference to the past was intended to contrast favourably with the present, 1820, but drunkenness was not greatly diminished. The bucket and pannikin still were in request at more remote parts of the colonies, and their use was recommended as a measure of police to prevent the drunkards from robbing each other. Poured into a bucket, none could be unfairly abstracted, all shared alike. But had it not been so arranged, some rogue of the party would have removed some bottles when the rest were off their guard, and thus reserved for himself the pleasures of intoxication, when the others were obliged, for lack of spirits, to be sober. 3. Cunningham. The following is a picture of things as they were. The madams on board occupy the few days which elapse before landing in preparing the most dazzling effect on their descent upon the Australian shore. With rich silk dresses, bonnets à la mode, ear pendants, brooches long, gorgeous shawls and splendid veils, silk stockings, kid gloves, and parasols in hand, dispensing sweet odours from their profusely perfumed forms, they are assigned as servants. The settler expected a servant but receives a princess. Mudie's felonry. This is doubtless the language of caricature, but the extravagant pretensions of many could be scarcely exaggerated. 4. When addressing the Secretary of State, Macquarie observes, "In my opinion, speaking of the voluntary settlers, they should consider they are coming to a convict country, and if they are too proud or too delicate in their feelings to associate with the population of this country, they should consider in time and bend their course to some other country, in which prejudices in this respect would meet with no opposition. No country in the world has been so advantageous to adventurers as New South Wales. The free settlers, coming out as such, have never felt their dignity hurt by trading with convicts, even when they were such. Again, it has been my invariable opinion that a free man, by pardon or emancipation, should be in all respects considered on a footing with every other man in the colony, according to his rank in life and character. In short, that no retrospect should, in any case, be had to his ever having been otherwise. Letter to Earl Bathurst, 1813. 5. Men are governed by words. Under the infamous term convict, are comprehended offenders of the most different degrees and species of guilt. One man is transported for stealing 3 hams and a pot of sausages. In the next berth to him is a young surgeon engaged in mutiny at the Nore. Another was so ill-read in history as to imagine that Ireland was ill-treated, and too bad a reasoner to suppose that 9 Catholics ought not to pay tithes to 1 Protestant. Then comes a man who set his house on fire. Another, the most glaring of all human villains, a poacher, driven from Europe, wife and child, by 30 lords of the manor for killing a partridge. Now all these are crimes, no doubt, but surely to which attach different degrees of contempt and horror. A warrant granted by a reformed bacon stealer would be absurd, but a hot-brained young blockhead who chose to favour the mutiny at the Nore may, when he is 40 years of age and has cast his Jacobin teeth, make a useful magistrate and loyal subject. The most inflexible were some of the regiments stationed at Botany Bay, men, of course, who had uniformly shunned the society of gamesters, prostitutes and drunkards, who had ruined no tailors, corrupted no wives, and had entitled themselves, by a long course of solemnity and decorum, to indulge in all the insolence of purity and virtue. Rev. S. Smith, 1823. His sentences are not only more severe than those of other magistrates, but the general opinion of the colony is that his character, as displayed in the administration of the penal law in New South Wales, is stamped with severity, big as report. Such was the idea of the people on the spot. But Mr. Wilberforce observed, in the House of Commons, he was a man who acquired the admiration of all who knew his merits, a man who shone as a bright example to the moral world, who deserved the title of a moral hero, who had overcome difficulties for the amelioration of his species in the most unfavourable circumstances, which would always endear his name to the friends of humanity. Wentworth. End of chapter 59, being transportation. Section 8.